All right, guys. So, welcome to another video. And this video is going to be a series that I'm doing on YouTube and for my students called TypeScript for Beginners. So, a lot of developers are having to learn TypeScript because it's the closest thing to, a safe programming paradigm for a dynamic language like JavaScript that we can get. So, what I have here is I just have a sample project that I created with TypeScript. And what I'm doing now is I'm just starting up a server. And because I'm using the Node Package Manager, I'm going to just run a command called npm start. So let me make sure I don't have the server running already. And I'm just running this script, which can be found in my package.json. So if you're new to React, all of the scripts that you're going to be using for a particular project will go inside of your package.json. Your package.json will let you know all the dependencies, all the packages, and some of the configuration that you have set up, as well as other details that you will need in the future once you get deeper and deeper into the development process. So npm start is starting now, and what it's doing is it's running my server on port 3000, which is the default port that all React applications run on, and it's loading up right now, and it should show a gray background once it's done loading. So sometimes it can take a minute, but let's see, it should be working. All right, so this is our app, and again, our app doesn't have anything in it yet. It's just a blank page with a gray background. So the point of this video is to introduce you guys to testing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start out writing some very, very, very basic tests. Then we'll add on and add on and add on. And that's the best way to learn, is to learn in stages, right? So we have a test here that comes written by default, and it says the name of this test is renders learn React link. And so what this is really saying is that whatever we write here next to test, or in some cases, you might also see the syntax it before you see a test. And so what that string there needs to say is it needs to describe exactly what behavior you're expecting. All right. And so this is where test driven development and behavioral driven development kind of converge, because you need to start thinking about your test as behaviors. And you need to also start thinking about each test as a specification. So this test definitely is not going to work because we have changed the app component. So we're just going to get rid of everything after the initial test string. And we're going to say we want this test to actually render an input form. All right, very simple. So this test is just going to render an input form, and then we need to call the render method from the React testing library. And the React testing library allows us to pass in a JSX element as our argument of any type. And so we're just going to say we want to pass in our input form component. And notice how this is written, right? This input form component actually compiles down to a React.create element. But what we have here with React is we have what we call um, direct writing, right? And so what it's doing here is it's expecting an input form, but we don't have one. And that's why we have the red squiggly line there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm showing you the order that you should get used to going in. Notice that I didn't start coding. I didn't start writing anything. I literally just created a test. And I would expect that test to fail because I haven't created an input form yet. So to test all of my tests, I'm just going to write npm and then test. You may be wondering, how did I know that? Well, if you go here to your package.json file, you'll see that a test script, the React scripts test, is written with the command test. Okay, so all scripts go after npm, and you can change this on the fly. So we are determining which test suites to run, and you see that it's running app.test.tsx, and we're just waiting for it to actually run this test. It shouldn't take too long. So it's running our test and making sure that it works or doesn't work right now. And it should be done any moment now. All right. So we are done. And let's see what happened. So we scroll up, our test failed, and it tells us that our test failed in about 19 seconds. And this is how you want to start your development process. This is totally opposite from what most courses online or most tutorials will teach you. They'll teach you to just start coding, but you want to start testing first. So with that in mind, with the failing test, our goal here is very simple. It's to create a test that passes. So let's go to our source folder and let's create a new file. And we're going to call this file inputform.tsx. And this inputform.tsx is going to do a couple of imports. So we need to import React, right? And we also need to import function component. And we also need to import use state. And we want to import them from the React library. All right. So now that we've done that, we want to say we want to have an input form and we're going to store it as a variable. And we're going to set a type to it called function component. And this just lets TypeScript know that, hey, we're expecting a functional component here, not any other type of component like a class-based component, right? So we're going to set that equal to an arrow function. This syntax right here is new syntax that was introduced in ES6. So if you don't know about arrow functions, I will be doing a separate video on that. So don't worry about that if you can't read this right away. So we have an input form, which has a type function component, which is an arrow function, which returns some values. So we want to say return, and we just want to return a div with a class name of, let's say, input form. And inside of there, we're going to create an input. And to create an input JSX element, we just write input and we give it a type. And we say input type equals text. And we just close it like so. All right. We don't add anything to it. We're just doing a very basic thing here. Last thing I want to do is actually default export this input form. That way I can test it. So we have officially created just a very basic component, which is an input form. And now we want to actually render that input form on our home page. So to do that, we're going to import input form from input form, and we're going to place that inside of header, and we're just going to type out the element in the component input form. All right. Now we've added this input form to our home page. And so if we go to our home page, we should see an input form now. So yeah, this is the input form that we just created, guys. All right. So we have an input form now that we've created. Now I just want to do a couple of more things with this, right? So before I run my test again, let's go back to inputform.tsx. All right. You can see that I imported use state. All right. Use state is a way to track changes based on the state change of whatever your user is doing. So we want to say that we want to actually have some state here. So we need to use that state hook. And for this input, we're going to have, let's say, an email and a password, right? So we want to say const email set email equal to use state. And for now, we're just going to pass in an empty string as the default value. So whatever you pass in here to use state is just the default state of this variable, email. All right. So let's continue working. So we want to add a placeholder into our input and we just want to call it email. So let's just call that email. And we want to render something. So let's use an H1. An H1 is a header tag in HTML, and in React, it's a JSX element as well. So we're going to say my email is email. right? And because we're using state, we don't have to reference any properties. We don't have to reference that prop.email syntax that we usually would if we were using some sort of class. So we have an input, has a placeholder called email, and we have an H1 tag that says, look, my email is whatever I type in. So how do we actually track the changes based on our user doing something, right? So first of all, let's actually just save that file real quick and refresh. And you'll see here that the placeholder is here. We have email and our H1 is also there. So when we actually type something in here, it doesn't actually update what our email is because we haven't actually created some sort of handler. So we need to create some sort of handler or something that's going to say, look, when something changes, we want to actually keep track of those changes. So now we're going to set up an event handler, which is going to listen to that event. And if anything changes, then we're going to update our app, right? So, how do we do that? So, it's very, very simple. What we're going to do is we're going to create another variable and we're going to call that variable on change. So, underneath our initial hook, we're going to say const on change and we're going to set it equal to an event. Okay. And that event is going to be a React change event. And so in TypeScript, you have to specify what type of event you're expecting. So we're going to say React.change event. And that event is going to be listening to an HTML input element. Okay. So that is what we have set up so far. And after we actually start tracking our event, we need to actually add some more functionality to this. So we're going to go ahead and wait for us to track that email. So that set email is going to take the event at target at value, right? And now we can actually use the on change method by passing in the function as a prop. All right. And so we just pass in on change and we save, right? And so let's refresh our page. And whatever we type in inside this input form, like let's say my email is university at gmail.com. And so this state is now working. It is now tracking the input value of our HTML input element. And we also have an input form. Now that we've done those things, now I want to update our test. So we can see here that our test is still failing because it can't find input form. So let's just do input form from input form. And we're just rendering input form. That's all we're doing for now. And so we're going to save our test and then we're going to go back to our test and run our test again. And you can see here now that we are actually importing that input form and rendering that component, it says the test passed. All right, so congratulations. We have successfully written our first test, and we've started at a very basic level. And essentially, the first thing you want to start testing is making sure that stuff is actually rendered, right? So, in summary, right, what did we just go over? We went over the fact that you want to start off with a failing test first, then write your code, then make sure your test passes. When you follow this technique, it's going to save you time in the future because you're going to have a much clearer understanding of what you're writing, the design of what you're writing, and your debugging time is going to be a lot less. So let's say we want to write another test, right? And let's just call this test, say, this component has an email. All right, so that's just what we're testing. We're just testing to see if it has an email, and we're going to the return statement, and we're going to say let email equal. Let's just do a random email and say James at yahoo.com, and we could say expect. I'm going to pass in, oops, sorry, that's not right. Expect email to be email. All right, and you see here that we have two tests and they're both passing. All right, so again, the behavior, you want to start thinking about the behavior that this input form is an email. So we want to start tracking that. And so you could take it a step further, right? And we could go further and say, well, I want to check and make sure that when the user clicks a submit button, that it actually submits. Or if a user clicks a button, that that button is actually receiving an input from the user. So this is just a foundation on test-driven development. I hope you guys learned something from this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.